because Guillemard and Jackson Square is one of the most important possessions of Louisiana. The buildings are probably the most noticed and beautiful buildings, and you have to give Guillemard the credit for his talent of not only being an architect, but the beauty in his drawings, his surveys, his military experience, and all the other things that he did. The builder of the Cabildo, the St. Louis Cathedral, and the Presbytery left New Orleans being owed a lot of money, and he went to Pensacola, and he was only there a few years before he died. And I firmly believe that he's buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Pensacola, Florida. We want to talk about history, the connection between the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain and New Orleans. There is some hidden history and distorted history that should be straightened out. The connection is by a very important historic person named Gilberto Guillemard. He was born in France. I won't go into details, but he joined the Spanish Army when young, and he came over to Louisiana in 1770. He impressed Galvez in several battles of Mobile, Baton Rouge, and so forth. He was wounded too, and his talent as a surveyor, architect, and builder. As he slowly got confidence, Galvez gave him promotions, and then his activities were varied. And not only was he a surveyor of talent, an architect, he designed the buildings of the Cabildo, the St. Louis Cathedral, and the Presbytery. Which you know is very important in Louisiana national history, New Orleans history, and Louisiana history. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people come every year, and they are attracted to the plaza, Jackson Square. It's how it all came about. We have a little story here that has been hidden about Gilberto Guillemard and how he built these three buildings. There was a fire, of course, everyone knows is in the book, that had three fires in New Orleans. Most of the buildings were wooden. And in 1788, a fire started on Good Friday, I believe, and destroyed half the town. And then again in 1792, they had another fire. Anyway, the buildings that are there now were designed and built by this architect, surveyor, builder, military man called Gilberto Guillemard, and his connection with the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. First of all, we're going to talk about the last 10 years of his life. Sadly, it was the worst 10 years of his life as far as economics and the way things went. But this is history, and you can't lie about it if it's in the book, in documents. But anyway, how he got to be, he was working on the buildings after the fire. Alamasser made a promise to the Council Cabildo to rebuild these buildings. And Gilberto Guillemard was selected. This is the first building he built, the Cabildo. The second building he built was the St. Louis Cathedral. It became, the church became the cathedral. The third building that he was working on was a presbytery. But because when he just went across the lake, he was working on this building. He had it only to the first floor. He wasn't finished. But the man who asked him to come over and do a survey for him was called Morgan Edwards, the man who lived across there. He was having trouble with one Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller got a Spanish land grant from Coronel. Before Coronel didn't check it out before he made the grant. The land had already been given to Morgan Edwards by Governor Esteban Miro in 1783. Here in the 1790s, Miller wants to get the land. He claims to build a brickyard for the houses that were burned in New Orleans. But anyway, Morgan Edwards was a friend of Valamaster's. He goes to New Orleans and he says, look, this guy's trying to take my land. I never had a survey done. Could you send Gilberto Guillemard across there and make a survey? He said, yeah. He's working on the presbytery. He only has the first floor, but go across and do the survey. Guillemard goes across, and I have a beautiful big map, huge map. This is a short part of it, of the survey that he made. And he took 3 weeks, the last week in December and 2 weeks in January, and he makes this from showing that Morgan Edwards in pink really did own that land that Miller tried to claim. And this is the start of our story with Guillemard. Guillemard goes back and he starts to work on the presbytery again. But things started to go wrong, bad for him. Alamaster, his benefactor and the money man, dies within 4 months. And to make it worse, he was paying for the building of the presbytery and the other churches and the other two buildings. But the worst part is his young widow, Alamaster, says, I'm not paying any more on building those buildings. And Gilberto Guillemard's salary was included in there. He only been paid just a part of the salary. But anyway, so Guillemard keeps busy with other things. The levee breaks. He helps design and fix the levee by New Orleans. Water gets in the streets in the French Quarter, what is going to be called French Quarter, and he helps to build 2 bridges across Bourbon Street and another street. There was uprising of the slaves, and there were 325 were led by Gilberto. Gilbert led a posse there and captured 325 and brought. So Gilberto Guillemard was kept busy by the Cabildo, the council. The trouble is they didn't have any money either. And then along comes another thing that happened. It was called the Louisiana Purchase, where the Spanish had to turn the land back to France. Napoleon made them do it. And then Napoleon sold it to America, and the Spanish had to get out. So here's Guillemard being owed his a year and so salary. He's hurting financially, and he can't collect it. And the Spanish officials and military people start to pull out. The only 2 left was the intendant Juan Ventura Morales and Guillemard. Morales was selling, he was the intendant, and he could issue and sell land grants. Across the lake, the Spanish still had West Florida. So Morales was selling fraudulent land he couldn't do across the lake. It wasn't surveyed. He didn't have the authority anymore. But anyway, Guillemard tried to get money to get another job. He even offered to go to Texas to be the intendant at San Antonio and was turned down for that. Governor Claiborne got fed up with Morales and his shenanigans in New Orleans and told him to get out. So Morales and Guillemard left and went across the lake to Pensacola. Now, soon after that, he got over there a couple of years later. In 1807, 1808, his wife tells him she wants him to write a letter to Morales, who was in charge of the land grants over on the North Shore now, of being over there, to get a survey done for our father's Spanish grant. Spanish grant was something I never heard of before. It was for 400,000 acres from the from Bayou, Bay St. Louis to the Pearl River, and we have a map of that, which will be in a story. Pintado, the surveyor, draws a map of it. The Spanish at the time, when they issued land grants, they just wrote it in a book, and you, to make it official, had to get the land grant. But anyway, it was swampland, and Louis Bizador, the surgeon, wanted to make a vestry, a cow herd, and he says only part of it's dry land. And he went to Miro, and Miro says, I think you're right, and he wrote it in the book. And we have a map of that to show you that. Anyway, Gilberto Guillemard, they needed money, and they thought that if they could get the land grant of the father's survey, they could sell part of it. And but anyway, it went to the Supreme Court for several years, for many years, and we have the story of that. The final analysis is they never did get the survey done. The Supreme Court did allow them 12,000 acres, a long ways from the 400,000 acres. And the family sold it in two parts, 6,000 and another, and got a little money. But basically, in a letter of the temporary governor Casacalvo to another official, stating that when Gilberto Guillemard left New Orleans, he was penniless. He didn't have any money. He was broke. He didn't get his salary. So anyway, he writes this letter in May. Pensacola wasn't a large town, but before the Spanish had it, the British had it. And the British, are from the northern latitudes and everything. But when they got West Florida, one Dr. Robert Ray from Auburn writes an article, West Florida, the graveyard for the Britons. The British start dying like flies, not only the troops, but the officials too. And they buried them wherever they could. There was no cemetery. And it was sort of scattered out a little bit. But anyway, in 1807, the year before Guillemard died, the king, Carlos of Spain, said to get the boundary lines of the cemetery fixed. I'll give it the name of St. Michael's, and you'll have an official cemetery. So Surveyor Pintado did just that. And some of the graves on the outside, he organized it and put them all together and made the boundary line. Whatever happened to Gilberto Guillemard, it probably was a wooden marker, because at that time they did have stone markers, but you had to have money to buy them. And we are positive that Gilberto Guillemard is buried in the cemetery, and they have two schools. One of them at the University of West Florida, called the Archaeology Institute, has a new system called GIS, using wavelengths to go into the ground and see if a body or burial is there. So we may find out later, but we are positive that Gilberto Guillemard, and so is the Archdiocese of New Orleans. On page 173 of the Sacramento Records, I think it's volume 6 or 7, I don't know which one, but it states here that Gilberto Guillemard, I'll read it. Gilberto, the father of Arnaldo and Isabel Marcherel, native of Langy in France, he was a sergeant major of New Orleans, of Pensacola at the time of Spanish rule. He was a lieutenant colonel of the Royal Army of His Catholic Majesty of Pensacola. His wife was Maria Felicia Barbeau Boisador, Boisdora. Her father was a surgeon for many years in New Orleans. Gilberto died 64 years old. He died November the 28th, 1808. I'll strongly suggest that yellow fever was the cause of his death. But that's not the end of the story. A few years later, his wife, Maria Felicia Boisador, wanted to go back to New Orleans. Her family was large back there. She only had one son, and he was a lieutenant in the Spanish in Pensacola, Hernando. Anyway, she was trying to get out of Pensacola in 1816. What was the population then? It was small. It only had 1,500 people before the yellow fever broke out that year. 2 years later, in 1818, they only had less than 1,000. So it was a very small town. Whatever happened to Maria Felicia Boisador, I don't know. But now the story takes up with Arnaldo, which is very, very interesting. He and several of the Spanish officers had a run-in with Andrew Jackson. Of course, the Spanish still held the land north of the lake, and Pensacola was one of their principal military bases. During the War of 1815, and the British attacked New Orleans, Jackson claimed that Hernando and several of the Spanish officers were the ones that guided the British into Bayou Benvenue and back to where Chalmette Battlefield is. I sort of take that with a grain of salt, because there were a lot of people that the British could have, the fishermen, the slaves and so forth, people who lived back there. It's true that the Spanish, who only had a few hundred people, troops, could not oppose the British landing and everything. Anyway, Jackson still had animosity towards some of the Spanish officers. He, when Arnold requested some. Jackson, when he occupied Pensacola, his father-in-law Villery was the lieutenant colonel, and he was his lieutenant. Opposed Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson took it. He put him in. He banished him from Pensacola. 11 officers. Most of them went to Cuba. But Villery, the father-in-law, and Gilberto Guillemard came back 4 months early. Jackson found out about that when he was in Nashville. He told him to stay out of Pensacola. When he found that out, he had him arrested and put in jail. And they were in the calaboose, the jail. Arnold writes this letter to Congress. Congress was in session today in Washington. And he writes a letter asking them to get out of jail, that they did nothing wrong. And so congressmen, and all the story is in the Pensacola newspaper. The congressman went to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, they had a conversation on the floor of Congress. And they went to the president, and the president gave the order to release him. So his father-in-law, Colonel Villery, and Arnold Guillemard got out of jail. Guillemard was still in Pensacola, Arnold, the son, in 1850 when census was taken. He had his wife and 2 daughters. He dies 8 years later in 1858. His wife continues to live on, and she dies in 1876. Right now, the School of Archaeology is doing a survey of the cemetery, and they know where they have maps that point out where the grave sites are, and I'm doing further research to find out exactly where in the St. Michael Cemetery is the graveyard of the Guillemards, and is there other burials in there? Is Gilberto Guillemard's grave in there? We'll only know after this survey and research has been done.